The rise of real estate investing in social media has been a popular topic of conversation, and for good reason. There are a lot of amazing things that can come from real estate investing. There's also a lot of work that goes into it as well. My brother and I have been managing rental properties since 2015, but for me, the goal is to build out a rental property portfolio. In this episode, I'm sharing my personal experience with renting out properties and the pros and cons of doing so. If you're interested in real estate investing, hopefully this episode sheds some light into the things you should think about when moving forward. Now, I want to kick this episode off by sharing my current rental property status. So currently, I manage 2 rental properties with my brother. We have our childhood home, which we'll call Courtney, which we grew up in with my mom. And then we have my dad's old home, which we'll call Kristen. So I'm going to start with Kristen because that was the first property we actually rented out. So when my dad passed away, my brother and I actually inherited the Kristen property. However, there was a mortgage on it. So in order for us to get the property into our name, we had to assume the mortgage. And the way we went about doing that was refinancing that mortgage into our names. So we had to go through the mortgage approval process. We had to go through everything. My boyfriend at the time had just moved to Austin and actually worked for a mortgage lending company. So he was kind of our point of contact and connected us with that company. And we were able to get everything finalized and got the mortgage in our names, and everything kind of worked out pretty nicely with that. I wish I would have paid more attention to the process. I didn't really go through the mortgage approval process until a couple years later when my boyfriend and I bought our current condo. But everything was pretty smooth, but now we had a mortgage. So my brother and I were not in a position to pay for a mortgage plus our own expenses. So our goal was to get that property rented out as soon as possible. He actually had a friend who was in real estate, and his friend was able to find tenants and get them moved in. I'm happy to say, and I think we really lucked out with this, but we had the same family live in that property for about 9 years. Actually, at the time of this recording, they just gave their 30-day notice. A little disappointing, but it was for good reason, and having them in there for 9 years with no issues. So we had no issues getting paid every month, the rent and everything. They were actually really great tenants. So very happy with how that went, although I know my brother and I are preparing for a major overhaul of that property. We did not put a lot of work into it when we actually got the property. We really didn't have the funds to do so. So not only was it a little dated before those tenants moved in, but here we are, 9 years later. I'm sure it is definitely going to need some work. So when we get to the cons portion of this episode, I will definitely talk about that. But a con is certainly having to keep up with the times when you own properties. But a pro is you could get lucky and have the same family in there for 9 years and never have any issues. So that's Kristen. Let's talk about Courtney. So Courtney is my brother and I's childhood home. We lived there with our mom. And when I moved back to California after my dad died, my mom's COPD was starting to get worse. And that home, the Courtney home, is a 2-story. So my mom would struggle going up the stairs. And so living in a 2-story house was not going to be a long-term thing for her. So she actually moved into an old property my dad had that actually was the house I was born in. So she moved into that house, and that left Courtney open. She was thinking about selling it, but since my brother and I had already had experience with the Kristen property, we convinced her to just rent it out. There was still a mortgage on it, so we had to figure out how can we get this mortgage covered, because my mom was like, I'm not going to pay for that if I'm not living there. So we ended up doing a little bit of work on that property before we rented it out for the first time. So it had very old carpet. It was just a worn house. I mean, we lived there for all our lives. It was a new build when we moved in, but almost 30 years later, it was maybe not that long, maybe like 27 years later, it definitely needed some work. So before we had the first tenant moved in, we got the carpets replaced and we did some like prep paint work. Nothing too crazy. The carpets was a big thing, but that was the extent of it. So from there, we worked with Coco, who has actually been on the podcast. I'll link to her episode. We worked with Coco, who's a real estate agent in Austin, to get our first tenants in there. And our first tenant was a woman with a dog who went in there. And I don't know if I was just spoiled with how Kristen was, but this tenant was much more needy. She was constantly reaching out. My brother was her first point of contact, but my brother is very direct and to the point, and like let's get to the point here. He doesn't necessarily sugarcoat things. And so their personalities just did not jive. So I became her point of contact. It actually got so bad that my mom kind of got involved. It was a whole thing. But anyways, she never had issues with paying her rent, which we'll take that as a win. But we did have to do some things along the way when she was renting out that house. The things she had us do were valid things, like the garage didn't open and she wanted the heater for the pool fixed. So just things that were understandable. But she was definitely a little harder to please than what we had experienced. I think after 2 years, she ended up leaving. So she gave her notice. We gave her back her security deposit and just parted ways amicably. And then we worked with Coco to get a second set of tenants in there. So working with a real estate agent to vet tenants is something I would highly, highly recommend. I mean, they will help promote the property. They will help do background searches. They will do the initial reviews with people. They will have people submit the applications. They will do all the showings. I mean, game changer. Not having to find tenants on our own, total game changer. So I would highly recommend that. But we got a family moved in there, and everything was fine with the family. They had a few things that they needed adjusted or just questions on, but they were very nice. And then they decided to, so the man was a business owner from California, and I guess he had decided to bring some of his employees from California to Austin, and his plan was to have them live in the house while him and his family found another house. So they ended up trying to do a sublease, which was fine. It worked out fine. Everything was vetted. I made sure that that tenant would be responsible or liable for the people he's recommending to come into the house, and everything ended up being fine. They were there for probably 3 years. No issues with paying rent. With the kind of subleases that moved in, they were just a bunch of different men. And so, it wasn't a family. They probably weren't taking as good of care of the property as maybe the family was, but it is what it is. No issues with rent. And they were pretty much self-sufficient. So they actually gave their notice October of 2023. So at that point, we definitely knew the property needed some work. Actually, let me take a step back. So they gave their notice October 2023, but my mom had actually passed away August of 2023, and that property was still in her name. So when she passed away, my brother and I actually inherited that property, and that property still had a mortgage when she passed away. So when that property became ours, or actually before that property officially became ours, my brother and I just took our own savings and paid the mortgage off. There was a big chunk of change left, but we had figured that, hey, we have enough in savings between the two of us to pay this mortgage off. That way, any rent we get can truly be ours outside of, taxes and insurance. So we decided to do that. And kind of the timing worked out nicely because then the tenants gave their notice. So imagine if we hadn't paid that mortgage off, then we would have had to deal with paying the mortgage payment until we got new tenants in there. So it worked out nicely. But the property needed some work. So really from November through the end of December, we repainted the house. We installed new blinds. We had deep cleans in there. Like, we did a lot of work on the property. It was pretty expensive. And that's why I'm definitely a little bit nervous about Kristen and the overhaul that needs. But fortunately, with all the work we put in, we were able to get good quality tenants in at the start of the year, and so far no issues. So that has been our experience with rental properties, or my experience with rental properties up until this point. And I do just want to add that we only have done and are currently only doing long-term rentals, so leases for over 1 year. We don't have any experience with short-term rentals at this point. So let's get into the pros of renting out properties. I think the biggest pro is monthly cash flow. Like, as long as there are no issues with people paying their rent every month between the 1st and the 5th of the month, you get your monthly rent payment. And ideally, your rent payment is factoring in if you have a mortgage, if you have like costs associated with the home, like HOA and stuff like that. And then there's a little bit extra for you to actually profit. So every time we get our monthly rental income payment, there's profit for us. Rent covers the Kristen rent covers the Kristen mortgage. The rent for Courtney, covers property taxes and insurance and things that will be needed for us to pay because there is no mortgage. So when you have a property that you're renting out with a mortgage, the property pays for itself. You have that rental income pay down the mortgage, and you're not using your own money to pay off a big asset. So that's definitely a pro of renting. Another pro is guaranteed income for the term of the lease. If your lease is for a year or longer, you know that at least for the next year, you're good to go. You have that money coming in. And once you receive notice, which is typically a 30-day notice, like, you have time to plan and figure things out. And hopefully you've been saving so that if you do have to cover costs while you get new tenants in there, it's not a financial burden. Another pro is that properties are lived in and maintained by the tenants. So this ensures that there are no squatters, or if there are issues, like valid issues with the house, like a pipe bursting or, a hole in the roof or something like that, we as property owners are notified quickly and we can fix the situation before it gets worse. And I would just say the final pro is that having a rental property, owning a rental property, is an additional asset. And it's an increase to your net worth. The value of that property increases over time, and therefore your net worth increases over time. And then I will say, if you are lucky to not have any issues with like income payments or rental payments coming in, then it is a very smooth process. Now let's transition to some of the cons of renting out properties, because as great as real estate investing is, as great as owning and managing rental properties is, there are also downsides. And I feel like people don't really want to talk about that or don't want to acknowledge it, but they are there. And I am going to lay it on you based on my own experiences. So the first con is obviously the cost of preparing the home to rent. So deep cleaning the carpets, deep cleaning the home, replacing the carpets, painting the walls, upgrades you have to do to the house. Those things add up quickly. So you definitely have to manage your money, manage your budget, but also you don't want to go crazy and do all of the things, right? Work with someone who can tell you the most important things that need to get done. And then as people are looking at the house, just take their feedback and apply it as best you can. Finding a contractor that you trust that that you trust, but also that does good quality work is very important. I said contractor. I think that it's probably not the best term. Maybe the term I mean is like a handyman, somebody who could do work on the property that you need done at an affordable rate, but also quality is there. Another con is cost of things going wrong in the home while you have tenants there. So you are the landlord. If you live in an apartment and your fridge breaks, you call the landlord and they get it fixed, right? But when you own and manage rental properties, you are the landlord. So if something breaks, they're calling you to fix it. My brother and I don't leverage property management companies, so we're managing these properties on our own. If we had a property management company, we would not get those phone calls, but we would have to pay for that. And we really haven't found that to be necessary at this point in time. But like I was saying, if something goes wrong, they're calling you. So if you're having a busy day and they say their AC went out, you have to stop what you're doing and make sure their AC gets fixed. And it's indicated in your lease too. You have a certain amount of time before you actually have to get things fixed, especially if there's a detriment to their livelihood. So that's definitely a con. Another con, and maybe adding to that, is the inconvenience factor. When things do go wrong, it's usually not at the most opportune time, but that doesn't matter. You have to act fast, act accordingly, and prioritize making sure that they are taken care of. Another con is the additional wear and tear of the property over time. And I feel like this would happen with any property. I mean, if you live somewhere for a long period of time, there's going to be wear and tear, but people don't care about your stuff as much as you care about your stuff. So you may have good tenants that, do their best to take care of the property, but then you'll have people who don't care. And they're just living there temporarily and they know it. And so they do whatever they want. And then when the time comes to move them out or get them out and see the aftermath, it's not always pleasant. So that's definitely a con. Another con, and I think this is a little specific to me and my situation, is pools. So one of the properties we rent out actually has a pool. So there are additional costs to ensure that the pool is maintained and up and running and no issues. There's also additional liability with pools, right? If you have families in there and something goes wrong, there's the opportunity for more liability. So one thing that my brother and I did at the direction of our mother, because this was the Courtney home, was add an addendum in the lease agreement that says anything that happens with the pool is we are free from any liability. So I would definitely recommend doing that. It's never been an issue, thank goodness, but if it was, we have been released of that liability. And then the final con is sometimes we have to front our own money until the rental account builds back up. So the way my brother and I have done this is we have a rental account and all the income goes in there, all of the expenses come out of there. But just depending on where we're at with that account in life, sometimes we've had to front our own money because we didn't have enough in the rental account. This usually happens when somebody moves out and the revamp process costs more than planned. But another instance was when we actually paid off the mortgage. I mean, we did not have enough in the rental account to pay off the mortgage and still make sure everything could function as it should. So we had to put our own money into it. Granted, it's your property, right? So if you're putting money into it, it's for the good of the property. But hey, if you got other things going on, like a business, your own home and things to worry about, that can definitely be something that is a little bit stressful. Overall, though, I would definitely say that having a rental property is worth it. For me personally, I think the cons, I'm okay with the cons because the good outweighs the bad, the pros outweigh the cons. And actually, I have future goals of more rental properties by myself or even with my boyfriend. My next property that I'm focused on getting is the Palm Springs home. I've talked about that on the podcast, but my intention for that property is for it to double as a second home and a short-term rental. So I'm really excited to test out short-term rentals. I have no experience with Airbnb, Vrbo, things like that. So it will definitely take some learning and getting used to, but I'm looking forward to it. And then a goal that my boyfriend and I actually have is to purchase our first rental property together. This will likely be a long-term rental in an up-and-coming neighborhood in some suburb of Austin. We want it to be close. We want it to be affordable, just to get started on our rental property journey. So that is what's coming next. Eventually, I'd love a rental property empire. I think being able to do that, manage that, have that would be exciting and definitely something I'm interested in. Now, I want you to check out episode 133 with Antonio Cuciniello of InvestStarters. He came on the show and talked about how to purchase your first real estate investment property. He shared so much great information. So if you're interested in that, I hope this episode helps, but I definitely want you to check that one out too. And I'll make sure to link to it in the show notes.